Good morning, and thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor to welcome you here today for the unveiling of the most detailed global inventory of specific sites of the largest sources of greenhouse gas pollution all over the planet. We are grateful and honored, deeply honored, to be joined this morning by Secretary General Guterres, as well as by UNFCCC's Executive Secretary Simon Steele and Assistant Secretary General Selwyn Hart. I want to extend my sincere thanks to your entire team, Mr. Secretary General, at the UNFCCC, UNEP, the WMO, where the technical experts have done such a terrific job for so long, and beyond. We are all working toward a common goal: increased transparency, collaboration, and accountability for climate action. We must work together with the best available information if we are to exit this highway to climate hell, as you so clearly described it in your opening remarks on Monday. I have been deeply inspired by your leadership and vision to push world leaders in every country and non-state actors and the global community forward towards solutions for the climate crisis. So it is my honor to have your support and collaboration on this effort that I believe can be a true game changer for our planet. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Secretary General Antonio Guterres.
Dear friends, it's an enormous pleasure to be here with Al Gore here today. He has been the voice of reason, the voice that all the time has inspired us to fight against climate change and to make sure that we mobilize the international community as a whole to rescue our planet. So, dear Al Gore, thank you so very much for everything you have been doing, and thank you very much for this fantastic initiative that you are launching today. So the world is losing the race against the climate crisis, but I'm hopeful because of you. You have been relentless in holding decision makers to account. No. I think that I was given the wrong speech. I'm going to speak to the group of young people afterwards, and there was a small confusion. I apologize. But let me begin by once again thanking the Climate Trace Coalition and Al Gore for this critical initiative. The climate crisis is in front of our eyes, but also hidden in plain sight. We have huge emissions gaps, finance gaps, adaptation gaps, but those gaps cannot be effectively addressed without plugging the data gaps. After all, it is impossible to effectively manage and control what we cannot measure. Timely and granular data on the sources of the emissions is essential, but we are still lacking a full picture. And many significant sources of emissions are not yet on our radar in real time. And that is where this initiative comes in. And indeed, Climate Trace will be ushering in an era of radical transparency for emissions tracking, providing independent emissions data based primarily on direct observation of emitting activities. You are making it more difficult to greenwash or, to be more clear, to cheat. One of the most striking early insights from this work is the scale of emissions from oil and gas production, particularly those that have not yet been previously reported. Climate Trace and its data show that because of underreporting of methane leaks, flaring, and other activities associated with oil and gas production, emissions are many times higher than previously reported. And this should be a wake-up call for governments and the financial sector, especially those that continue to invest in and underwrite fossil fuel pollution. The problem is even greater than we were led to believe, and that means we must work even harder to accelerate the phase-out of all fossil fuels. Today, the Climate Trace Coalition is releasing a detailed inventory of global emissions. This data set is a critical resource for business leaders working to decarbonize their supply chains, for governments working to align policy making with their national climate action plans, and for investors working to track private sector progress towards net zero. Climate action must be guided by science, data, and facts. Thank you for helping to reveal the full picture of the challenge that underscores the need to act, and act now. Congratulations on this initiative, and thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary General, when I was Vice President of the United States, I had the privilege of sitting on the dais in the Congress of the United States during the State of the Union address each year when former President Clinton gave his speech. And on one occasion, he took the standing ovation and faced the Congress, started reading his speech. He turned around and came to me and said, "Al, they have the wrong speech on the teleprompter." So I gave the word to his staff, and he vamped. He just experimented for 7 minutes, and it was the best part of the speech. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to get my clicker here for the slideshow, and I'm going to invite one of my key co-founders of Climate Trace to come out on stage. And bring the clicker with you, if you would, Gavin. Gavin McCormick, one of the key co-founders. And, okay, well, you're not the only one with a glitch this morning, Mr. Secretary General. Oh, it's where? Oh, it's on the computer, okay. We've had no rehearsals, so why don't you have a seat here? Ladies and gentlemen, this is an exciting morning for my co-founders and I at Climate Trace. And I want to start with some context with the slides that I hope will be coming up at this point. Here we go. This, of course, is the Earthrise image. And we are causing the climate crisis by spewing 162 million tons of man-made global warming pollution into that thin shell of atmosphere around our planet every day as if it's an open sewer. It is not an open sewer. It is a very thin shell. If you could drive an automobile straight up in the air from the ground, you would get to the top of that blue line in about 5 to 7 minutes. Below you would be all the greenhouse gas pollution. It lingers there, it accumulates, and the amount that is there today traps as much extra heat as would be released by 600,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding on the Earth every single day, 365 days per year. That is a lot of energy. And when you multiply that energy by 600,000 times a single day, that is what is causing the problem. The sources of the greenhouse gas pollution are multiple. They come from agriculture, conventional agriculture, mining, the burning of forests, now the beginning of the thawing of the permafrost. But the largest source by far is the burning of fossil fuels. And you can see that this accumulation began to accelerate dramatically after World War II. And if you will direct your attention to the upper right-hand corner of that graph, you will see a small notch. That's the pandemic. We'll come back to that. Gavin and I will in a moment. It went down 6%, and then the following year it went back up 7%. But all of that extra heat being trapped by the global warming pollution is what's driving the temperatures on Earth up to unprecedented levels. 20 of the 21 hottest years ever measured with instruments have been since the year 2002, and the 8 hottest years of all have been the last 8 years. 2 months ago, in September, at the UN General Assembly meeting, Secretary Guterres told us about the heat waves in Europe, the floods in Pakistan, the severe droughts, and he linked it all correctly as the price of humanity's fossil fuel addiction. Indeed, the heat wave in China, 70 days above 40 degrees, the most severe heat wave ever recorded, and the historians of climate tell us there is nothing in world climatic history even minimally comparable to what happened in China this year. The highest temperature this year was in the historic city of Shush in Iran, 53.6 degrees Celsius, 128.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Hottest summer ever recorded in Europe and in many areas. These are all the heat records that were broken last year. These are the presently uninhabitable zones on Earth, shaded. They are not that large a portion of the Earth's surface, but because of the continuing increase in heat and humidity, the scientists are warning us that these areas under business as usual are due to increase to a much larger size. This causes a huge increase in the movement of climate refugees across international borders. And on a global basis, 93% of this extra heat is put into the oceans. And it doesn't stay there. This causes many changes. It expands the size of the ocean, which raises sea level. It melts the ice in Greenland and Antarctica, which also raises sea level. That's the reason why this farmer's land in the Nile Delta, the most productive agricultural area of Egypt, is being salted from below in the root zone. Before the sea level comes over the shore, it invades the root zone. This is a pending catastrophe. We must act. The warmer oceans also increase the strength of hurricanes and cyclones and typhoons that come across the ocean. And just a few weeks ago, Hurricane Ian devastated some of the communities in the southern part of my country in Florida. And because the oceans warm up so extensively, they evaporate much more water vapor into the sky. It becomes what are called atmospheric rivers, and when they come across the land, they cause rain bombs, as some of the scientists are calling them. And this contributes to the massive flooding. In Nigeria, just 3 weeks ago, 1.3 million people were displaced. Soon after that, more than 1 million people were displaced in Chad. Africa is the most vulnerable continent to the climate crisis. But Southeast Asia and many other regions in the Pacific Islands, this flooding last month in Southeast Asia. Australia has been hit massively over and over again, this bridge before and after the flooding. Some of the communities there have gotten massive amounts of rainfall just in the last few months. And in Pakistan, 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater in early September. 33 million people affected, 1,700 people killed. South Africa earlier this year, the port of Durban was devastated, 450 people killed by the rain bombs and flooding there. And on a global basis, the insurance companies have measured that the impact of these climate-related catastrophes are increasing dramatically. In the last decade, they cost the global economy $2.5 trillion, an increase of almost $1 trillion over the 10 years before that. The same extra heat is drying the rivers and deepening droughts. This is Gingwang Lake in China, which has experienced worst drought ever in their history. This entire country has been affected dramatically. Europe as well, the Loire River, the Garden River of France, the Rhine in Germany, the Po in Italy, the Mississippi in the United States, the Yangtze in China, and others. In the southwestern part of my country, it has been drier than at any time in 1,200 years at least. So the cost of the climate crisis is adding up. And in this brief summary, we haven't even talked about ocean acidification or what many regard as the worst of it, the loss of biodiversity and the sixth great extinction and the increase of infectious diseases. It is also the #1 threat to the global economy. But there is good news. We are at a turning point, but we have the solutions at hand. We are now seeing the attention paid to solar because we get more energy from the sun in 1 hour than the entire global economy uses for a full year. And last year, if you look at all new electricity generation installed worldwide, 90% of it was renewable, most all of that solar and wind. 1 year before the Paris Agreement, electricity from solar and wind was cheaper than that from new fossil fuel plants in only 1% of the world. By 5 years later, solar and wind provided the cheapest source in 2/3 of the world, and within 2 years it will be cheaper in almost 100% of the world. In Egypt, we see a demonstration of the possibilities. Africa has 4 world's potential for renewable energy. The potential for wind and solar in Africa is 400 times larger than Africa's total fossil fuel reserves, and it comes pollution-free and creates more jobs. But there is a finance gap. They need in Africa an enormous amount compared to the meager flows of funding. That is why there is so much attention at this COP to changing the global capital allocation system. Here's what's going to renewable energy systems in Africa today. This is the total for mitigation. But look at the financing for fossil fuel, much larger, and the fossil fuel subsidies are larger still. This is insane. This must be changed. Look at the role of private capital funding for renewable energy systems in the United States and Canada. 96%. Look in Africa, 14%. The public funding is only 4% in North America, but it requires 86% of the financing in Africa. That's why it is not being built in Africa. We have to change this because almost 90% of the increased emissions going forward are going to come from developing countries. Now, Climate Trace is launching its inventory today to bring clarity to why we have to reduce these emissions and exactly where the emissions are coming from. This system, all of these spikes you see, the height of each spike illustrates the volume of global warming pollution coming from each location. The Climate Trace Coalition is made up of a number of organizations. It is my honor to be a part of it. My colleague, Gavin McCormick, will speak in just a moment. But we have more than 100 other organizations that are actively contributing to it. We are grateful to them, and we invite others to join with their data and their insights. This is a global, collaborative, independent effort. Governments are not a part of it, and we have a wonderful scientific collaborative team. Here's what we're delivering today: a complete inventory of the significant emission sites in 241 countries and territories, 194 member nations. Emissions from every major sector and subsector. The largest individual sources in 20 subsectors, including more than 72,000 of the largest individual point sources, and all of the significant greenhouse gases on a 20-year and 100-year average. How do we do it? We zoom in and measure in multiple ways, and I'm going to ask Gavin McCormick to illustrate how.
Thank you so much. So the key concept behind Climate Trace is sort of two things. One, it's a coalition of many organizations sharing data. I'll speak more about that in a second. But also fundamentally it's the concept that instead of asking emitters how much they emitted and tallying this manually, looking directly through observation and remote sensing allows us to have an independent look at facilities, and it allows us to have a look at any facility in the planet in an open and transparent fashion. So what you are seeing here is a methodology that is not unique to any one country. It does not depend on any unique data set or information only available in a few areas. Let me walk you through an example of how this technology works. So what we're looking at is the Gary Works steel mill, the same one you just saw zoomed in. And what we are seeing here is a photograph that captures the thermal infrared heat at this steel mill at a particular time when the satellite was overhead. So what the algorithms are doing, we are using computer vision algorithms to look, first of all, where do you typically see heat in the same area? Why are we looking at heat? Because the steel process, unlike many other industrial processes, happens to run particularly warm. So in this particular sector, if you want to figure out where the sources of emissions are, looking at heat is a good way. In other sectors, you might use other methods. So we've run algorithms first to figure out where the emissions are coming from. And then the second thing, we've had a team of expert annotators at a couple of organizations characterize those emissions. So what you're seeing here, for example, is the basic oxygen furnace and the blast furnace are different components of the same steel mill that in addition to seeing their heat, we can characterize what industrial process is that and what kind of emissions factors might you be applying. What that allows us then to do is every time a satellite passes overhead, say, okay, at those locations, which we've now characterized how to interpret them with the algorithm, what heat are we seeing right now? So for example, you're looking right now at a satellite overpass in Q1 2020, but at a different moment in Q2 2020, you can see there is less heat. And so that actually allows us to estimate the emissions at a typical moment, but a 50% drop in emissions the second time we looked.
Yeah, and if you will remember the data from the International Energy Agency showing that gap with the pandemic, let's zoom in on that and correlate it to the last two images that Gavin showed. This is just before the pandemic on the left where the normal emissions were measured. And once the pandemic caused the shutdown, the emissions went down. We can see this effect not only from the pandemic, from multiple sources all around the world.
And we do this in every sector. So for example, here we are looking at a power plant. If you look at the image on the left, this is a series of satellite overpasses at the same facility at different times. We're able to match that with the historical record, both of photographs. So see how in one of those images you can see steam coming out of the plant on the right, but on the left you can't. We can cross-index that with sensors on the ground. So this is a US power plant that happens to have an hourly emission sensor on it. And we can see at the hour on the left that photo was taken, we were seeing low emissions. And from space, it's very clear what that looks like. At the hour on the right, we were seeing high emissions. From space, it's very clear what that looks like. And we are training algorithms to look at what that looks like in a series of images over time, as we're representing here with the video on the right. So the fundamental method is we have open satellite data that we are looking directly at sources of emissions. We're combining that with the combined pool data from over 100 institutions and 30,000 sensors. And then we are using artificial intelligence to know how to interpret these photographs based on the historical record of things that had on-site sensors. So the next thing we've done is we've applied similar algorithms sourced by different organizations in every sector. So for example, Ocean Mind is a nonprofit that is the sector lead pulling together different organizations' work in transportation and the marine sector. RMI is looking at oil and gas emissions and has found very interesting things with the coalition it's working on in emissions from oil and gas. We have a number of organizations from, I think, every continent except Antarctica contributing to each different sector using different methodologies, but all having this fundamental approach of satellite-based observation trained against sensors on the ground. So I'm going to hand it back here.
Yeah, the reason Methane can be much more easily observed directly with sensors in space, but the reason CO2 is different is that, as this slide illustrates, the signal-to-noise ratio defies the ability to measure CO2 directly only by looking at it. You have to use artificial intelligence to combine information about the heat that is coming from the device, the smoke plumes, the ripples of water in the cooling pond, the fan blades, the internet data streams, and combine them all into algorithms that become predictive and more accurate as more information is combined with it.
Thank you. So we began looking directly at CO2, assuming that was the simplest way to look for CO2. And on the list here, you're seeing signals that we use to independently estimate the emissions of power plants. And to our surprise, although you can see CO2 near power plants, it didn't even crack the top 4 list of most effective ways to do that. Directly looking for CO2, for the reasons just mentioned, can work. But what turns out to work better is using imagery like from China's Gaofen 6 satellite to look at vapor plumes that are highly correlated with when a power plant is heavily emitting. To use imagery like US's Landsat 8 from NASA that allows us to get a thermal look at power plants. The European Space Agency's TRPOMI instrument allows us to look at co-pollutants, which are highly correlated with GHG emissions. And then from the commercial sector, we've increasingly found some very unusual algorithms. So I'd like to think this is something that artificial intelligence is a must-have for. It turns out that in satellite imagery, when a fan blade is spinning very quickly, you can see that from space. And on many types of facilities, that is a dead giveaway that it is emitting highly at that time. So by looking at somewhat unconventional things like cooling technologies and having a cross-verified sense, this first of all improves accuracy, but it also means that it would be functionally impossible to falsify this. You would need to, if you even wanted to falsify these data, not just submit some report claiming the emissions are different, you would be able to interfere with the satellite imagery of 4 different governments with 4 different teams, and you would need to do that in a way that doesn't leave any trail, even when we are having multiple experts examine all the same data.
So to use your phrase, Mr. Secretary General, it makes it impossible for the emitters to cheat. They cannot cheat with this system. So this is the first global, thank you, this is the first global database. And Gavin, take them through this is the website, which is live right now.
Sure, so anyone can see what we're demoing here, but we thought a video might be safer in case the Wi-Fi goes down. So you are looking at a video recording of climatetrace.org, which went live this morning, and we are zooming in on individual facilities. So the Permian Basin in Texas, for example, is the #1 emitting asset on the planet. But you can also look at different facilities and get a sense in the database of how do the emissions of individual sources compare to each other. Do things like cattle feedlots and agriculture compare to oil and gas? We wanted to make it possible not just for experts to look at the emissions of countries, but for anyone to look at their own local community and the largest sources of emissions in that community, and to be able to categorize and compare different sources of emissions, regardless of what country they're in, what sector they're in, organizations had to contribute to those particular algorithms, and we provided this in a truly globally comprehensive view. So in addition to being able to look anywhere in the world, you filter by different countries, you can filter by types of emissions. We have a compare tool for analysts to go in, load the data themselves, look advanced view. We are hoping that anyone can use this inventory. So I mentioned that we are highly collaborative. One of the things we've made sure to do is to provide all the metadata for scientists who are interested to download this. So anyone can go to the website in CSV format. We have JSON format coming soon to be able to look at the full data and analyze for yourself what you're seeing.
Also, all of the forestry data can be downloaded directly from the website, and they will be added to the visualization. We can also identify the largest sectors that are producing pollution. As you can see, electricity generation is the largest, oil and gas production, and the rest. We can identify the largest sources country by country. These are the top 50 assets that are contributing greenhouse gas pollution in China. These are the top 50 in the United States. These are the top 50 in India. These are the top 50 in the European Union. and we can then look at country by country, and you can see, as people know, the largest emitter is China, the second largest is the United States of America. But here we add to it methane. And we are seeing now much more accurately the volumes of methane emissions. We add to that nitrous oxides, and we have this data for the last 6 years for every significant emitting site in the world, country by country. And by the way, the top 14 individual sources of emission in the world are all oil and gas fields. The Permian Basin, as Gavin just mentioned, is #1 in the world. And we found last year, shockingly, that oil and gas production emissions were about double what they had reported to the United Nations. With new data on the flaring and the methane leaks, we now estimate that the actual emissions are likely 3 times higher than what they have reported. The top 500 sources emit more per year than the United States, and 51% of those emissions are from power plants. Half of the top 50 globally are oil and gas fields. This is the self-reported CO2 equivalent emissions. That includes CO2 and methane. This is what the actual measurements show. This is really shocking. And it's important because methane has been increasing, and each methane molecule traps as much extra heat as 82 times more than each molecule of CO2. Now, that's over a 20-year period, but this is, there has been a mystery among the scientists. Where is all this extra methane coming from? Well, it's coming from multiple sources, but we have found one of the principal, perhaps the principal source of the extra methane. Now, let me say, over 100 countries signed the methane pledge in Glasgow. I want to compliment and credit my former colleague, John Kerry, who is here for helping to get this global methane pledge. But these pledges have to be verified, and this is what makes the climate trace data actionable for verification. It's the first database for steel, which shows which steel facilities are cleaner per ton. We see it for rice, the methane emissions from rice on a 10-meter by 10-meter square grid worldwide. We see it for shipping, and we have virtually every major ship in the world. We see it for power plants, methane emissions from landfills. Our colleague Andrew Forrest is here, who's helped with that. And why don't you illustrate this, Gavin?
Sure. One of the most exciting things about this data set is that we're able to measure from space, surprisingly, not only the emissions, but additional metadata that will allow us to do something about it. So, for example, for global steel plants, we've lined them up here not in order of their total emissions, but in order of their emissions per ton of steel produced. Turns out we can actually characterize that. Why does that matter? Because it looks like if you want to have a lower carbon footprint for steel, it is not necessary to use less steel. Of course, efficiency is always good, but we now have an entirely secondary technique to reduce emissions, which is switching to facilities that use less steel. So we've characterized by combining both what we can see of the direct fossil fuel consumption at steel plants worldwide, but also our data on the energy intensity of the local power grid and their electricity consumption. And we've been speaking with corporations around the world who buy large quantities of steel to say, could we trigger a race to the top, perhaps even a voluntary one, by simply exposing the fact that many steel facilities have excess capacity that is much cleaner than other facilities right now. In many cases, we found there's actually no cost difference between these. So we think this is one of the real things that data can bring to the table, is new climate solutions that make it easier to reduce. And so a really good example of this is the Nucor steel plant in the United States, which has a carbon footprint of 0.551 tons of CO2 per ton of steel produced, compared to, we just picked another one in the database that has relatively large emissions, but the Nippon East Japan Works has about 4 times more emissions per ton of steel. And this means that with this particular pairing of plants, it is possible to begin finding ways to increase the capacity of some of the cleanest producing facilities per ton. And we see that pattern in many different sectors. So another very interesting example is in power plants.
Yeah, this is a power plant in Vietnam, and this is one in Uzbekistan. We're not picking the best and the worst. We're just showing this as an example. One of the activities that is very rigorous here at this COP is trying to find ways to accumulate funding within the world community for the building of more renewable energy sources. If we want to replace a heavily polluting power plant, why not start with the ones that are most polluting so we get more bang for the buck and we use the resources of funding that are available to start by reducing the most pollution that we can. The same thing is true with ships. We track the emissions from just about every large ship in the entire world. Here's an example of what we're talking about here.
So here we're looking at two different vessels which have different carbon footprints, and the Sydney Express, which has a flag state of Malta, whether or not it's physically based there at any given point in time, has a carbon footprint per nautical mile traveled, roughly double that of the APL Dublin out of Singapore. Now that's interesting because these vessels have a comparable engine class, comparable container capacity, and can take comparable routes. So that means it is a very practical and actionable thing right now for companies to begin exploring switching to cleaner vessels and methods like this. One of the things, though, that we're really excited the data can allow us to do is to encourage reduction rather than just switching business. So in the shipping sector, for example, it is very possible to reduce the carbon footprint of a vessel by operating it differently, in particular by using slow shipping. So we're also talking to corporations about the possibility of voluntarily reducing the carbon footprint of vessels that we can see from space if consumers are sometimes willing to get their goods a little slower. So we think data like this puts new carbon solutions on the table that often are win-win. And so we're really excited about a variety of different ways that you use data like this to reduce emissions in these 1-1 solutions. So we've talked a little bit here about different corporate sustainability teams that are worldwide looking how to get to net zero cheaper and particularly faster. And so some of this high quality data on the emissions intensity per unit of output for the global supply chain we think is going to be really helpful with that. But another example is investors who are pursuing net zero portfolios. It's often the case that investors we've spoken to don't actually have a good sense of how will they achieve a net zero portfolio. One of the things we often see is many companies don't report on their emissions. And they certainly don't do things like report on their emissions at the individual level of each asset and of output with game plans on how they could reduce. So we think that a globally available database that just puts on the table for everyone, here are all the largest sources of emissions and who owns them, which is one of the things that we're providing in the metadata, will make it easier for investors to actually get the job done.
And speaking of investors, the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative now has 291 signatories managing $66 trillion, half of all global assets under management. And as the Secretary General said earlier, this is one of the voluntary pledges that has to be verified. And by measuring where the emissions are coming from in the companies in these portfolios, asset managers can be held to account. But we are also seeing NGOs and activists who want to prioritize their activities to make sure that they're not just going everywhere, but they're strategically selecting the most significant institutions and pollution sources, banks and insurance companies, journalists who are always looking for the best available information, and governments, most of which do not presently have accurate emissions data. And yet all the governments of the world, not all, but 88 governments around the world representing 79% of global emissions have pledged a net zero target. They have not been able to identify exactly where they can reduce emissions most effectively, but Climate Trace builds upon existing inventories which are based on the national self-reporting and all of the global energy data sets, all of the primary global emissions data sets, and all of the secondary global emissions data sets are primarily based now on the national self-reports. And our compliments and admiration to UNFCCC, which has been working diligently to get the nations of the world to self-report more frequently. But the problem is some of them discovered their own mistakes. China, commendably, just before the Paris negotiation in 2015, recognized that its data was not accurate. They came forward and self-disclosed. Wait a minute, they said, we have found the emissions were higher than we had previously reported. Good for them. That is fantastic. But many countries simply do not have the resources to build and maintain their capacity to monitor emissions. And many national reports are not submitted to the UN in the manner the UN has requested them to do. Some are as much as 20 years out of date. Now, for any nation that requests our assistance, Climate Trace can provide all of the assistance necessary to monitor all of the emissions from every major point source in its territory every year for free. We are already providing that assistance to 6 subnational governments that have asked for help, and we will work with all others who request our help around the world. These are the 6 subnational governments that we're already working with. We shut off the list because we have to build our capacity in the years ahead, but we are working with these 6 now.
So one thing we just wanted to mention, why is it that we are able to provide all this assistance free? So there's no business model. Climate Trace is no intention of ever monetizing any data. This is all philanthropically supported. And so this is possible because of the generosity of groups such as Generation Investment Management Funds Partners, the firm Vice President Gore is associated with, Google.org, and another other donors who have decided to provide the funds to make it possible for scientists and universities to provide this information openly and free.
And full disclosure, my partners and I at Generation Investment Management are the largest funder of this. Google.org is the second largest funder. All of the funding sources are transparently identified on the website. Now, we have all of the technologies needed, according to the International Energy Agency, with proven deployment models to reduce emissions by 50% by the end of this decade, and to make that the way station forward to net zero by 2050. We are capable of solving this crisis because once the world reaches true net zero, temperatures will stop increasing in as little as 3 to 5 years. And if we stay at true net zero, half of the human-caused CO2 will fall out of the atmosphere in as little as 25 to 30 years. We are now seeing momentum. In August of this year, my country at long last adopted historic legislation, the largest climate package in the history of the world. Then in September of this year, Australia adopted a historic new law to reduce its emissions 43% below 2005 levels by 2030. And just a few days ago, the people of Brazil voted in favor of hope and justice and saving the Amazon rainforest by electing Lula da Silva as president. One of the great poets in my country, Wallace Stevens, wrote these words: after the final no, there comes a yes, and on that yes, the future world depends. We are now getting to the final no's. We are moving toward the yes that will save our future, and the young people here at Sharm el-Sheikh are demanding that we take action to solve this crisis. We intend to do it, and we hope that climatetrace.org, that's the website, it is live now, will enable all of the institutions and individuals with the ability to sharply reduce emissions much more quickly. And always remember, political will is itself a renewable resource. Thank you very much for being here this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job. Let's go off this way. This way. This way.